Hi, Dan Alasso with History for Today again. And this morning I'd like to tell you a little bit about the other thing that I'm having my historiography undergraduates at Bemidji State University read during the first week. This one is another presidential speech. This one from a couple years later in 1933, and it was given by Charles Beard. And this is Beard really kind of taking a position not unlike the one that Becker took about what history is and what its role is in life. So like Becker in 1931, this was a presidential address that Beard gave to the convention of the AHA in December 1933 in Urbana this time. Unlike Becker, Beard takes his first shot of the speech not at scientific history, but at the philosopher, and he's particularly thinking of Hegel here, who, in his words, possessing little or no acquaintance with history, sometimes pretends to expound the inner secret of history. Historians, however, get the last laugh, Beard says, because they are able to describe philosophers themselves as creatures of their historical moments and milieus, which, in Beard's words, gives their schemes of thought appropriate relativity. Beard does consider the scientific method an appropriate tool in history, although Beard agrees with Becker that all historians are, quote, influenced in their selection and ordering of materials by their biases, prejudices, beliefs, affections, general upbringing, and experience, particularly social and economic. He reiterates Becker's point that the past is so big and so complex that it would be absurd to accept the conception that it is possible to describe the past as it actually was, somewhat as the engineer describes a single machine. The originator of this idea, Beard says, is Leopold von Ranke, who lived from 1795 to 1886. And let me just go on a brief excursion into Ranke, because he is a very, very important figure in history. He was a German historian. He's seen as kind of the founder of modern source-based history, focusing on finding and then on analyzing primary sources, and then relating the results of those examinations in narrative form. Ranke was a professor at the University of Berlin for nearly 50 years, beginning in 1925. He was focused mostly on political history, and he was an opponent of Hegel's view of history as an unfolding of a teleological universal story, where the end was sort of foreordained. Ranke was also a political conservative who wrote against the liberalism of the early 19th century, which kind of culminated in the revolutionary year of 1848. He was also a proponent of what became known as scientific history, which is what Becker was sort of bashing in the last essay that I discussed. But this scientific history contributed a valuable element, the rejection of general universal theories that applied across all time and space, that sort of Hegelian idealism. He was later criticized, and I think rightly, for his belief that an objective history could be discovered and reported, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, or as it actually happened. The German philosopher Walter Benjamin called this idea the strongest narcotic of the 19th century. So Beard described Ranke as a German conservative writing after the storm and stress of the French Revolution. And this is very much in keeping with what Beard said earlier about philosophers and even historians being of and being partially determined by their worldview. And this, again, anticipates kind of postmodernism. So this desire to escape from the passions of that revolutionary era seemed to have led Ranke to embrace what Beard called the great conception of natural science, cold neutrality. Beard then goes on to describe two disturbing, what he calls intellectual formulas borrowed from natural science, which have cramped and distorted the operations of history as thought. These were simple linear causality, and then when that failed, a biological analogy, which Beard called a form of primitive animism, And he argued that that was really just the old determinism of physics covered with murky words. Both of these explanatory systems rely on what Beard called neat little chains of causation, which explain to their satisfaction, to the historian's satisfaction, why succeeding events happen. When these schemes fail, as they typically do, their proponents can blame incomplete or inaccurate data rather than a flawed hypothesis. The solution to this flawed approach, Beard says, is historical relativity, the formula that makes all written history merely relative to time and circumstance. The danger with such relativity, Beard warns, is that it leads to only three possible outcomes that he can see. The historian either decides that history as total actuality is chaos, and that the human mind cannot bring them, historical events, objectively into any all-embracing order. Another option is that history is cyclical, in his words, revolves in cycles eternally, which is kind of like Mircea Eliade's idea of the eternal return. Or the third option is that history is teleological, moving in some direction, which is what he had earlier criticized in Hegelian idealism. Beard concludes that it is impossible to actually write history as chaos, although he does say that it is possible to comment on history. So basically, the historian faces only two actual choices between a cyclical and a teleological alternative in this structure that Beard is setting up. But this is a choice, he says, that the historian makes without really having adequate knowledge. So this is the sense in which writing history is an act of faith. The historian's faith, Beard says, is at bottom a conviction that something true can be known about the movement of history. And this conviction is a subjective decision, not a purely objective discovery. Now, I would argue that there is an additional alternative to these three choices of chaos, eternal cycles, or teleology. A historian could choose modesty and not claim to be answering the ultimate questions of life, the universe, and everything, of which we now know that the actual answer is 42. And that's a little Douglas Adams reference for those of you who didn't get it. We could tell stories of change over time and try to find causes and connections without fooling ourselves that we've cracked some type of cosmic code. Even when we make global claims and posit general truths, we could acknowledge that these are generalities and are not likely to apply in all cases. And we could tie them to specific cases for our evidence and look at the commonality between different cases of the same type of event. In other words, we could be descriptive rather than normative. Now, appended to the end of this article, when it appeared in the American Historical Review, was a letter from Benedetto Croce, who lived from 1866 to 1952, and was an eminent Italian philosopher and historian and writer, who was actually nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 16 times. Beard had invited Croce, who was 67 at the time, to attend the AHA meeting, but probably due to the worldwide depression that was going on at the time, Croce had not been able to attend. Instead, he wrote a letter in which he said that the two most dangerous recent developments in history, in his opinion, were the materialistic and the racial interpretations. Croce, of course, was living in Europe in the 1930s at this time. So in the previous decades, he had faced the rise of the Soviet Union, and he was at the time living in fascist Italy. Croce actually wrote an anti-fascist manifesto in 1925. He wrote that although these two interpretations of materialism and racism are self-evidently absurd when they're examined closely, the danger in them actually lay in what he called the intellectual tendencies they generate and in prejudices they introduce by which they misguide and enfeeble thought. And I was kind of fascinated by this idea of absurd claims that are very easy to see through and debunk when you look at them directly, but that do damage anyway while they exist out there in the public sphere. Not so much because people believe them, but because the arguments around them kind of poison the discourse, and having to talk about them basically makes everybody stupider. I think this is something we've seen a striking example of in the past 5 years in American politics, although maybe that very obvious example and instance ought to call our attention to a more insidious, less apparent process that has actually been going on for much longer. And maybe that's an example for me of how I think historical thinking ties to the present and our present interests and concerns and problems. So I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again